Hello, welcome to another episode of Arthritis and You, A Joint Journey. Today, we've got something special lined up, so buckle up because it's time for the deep dive. Let's give a warm welcome to our hosts, Arthur and Sarah.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into something new today?
Absolutely. Always up for a challenge.
This time we're tackling fibromyalgia with all these resources from Alberta Rheumatology, their website, some YouTube videos. Looks like fascinating stuff.
Definitely an important topic. A lot of people are affected by it.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting? We were going through this material, and it turns out fibromyalgia used to be lumped in with a bunch of other conditions.
Really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, they called it rheumatism, of all things. Can you imagine?
Wow, talk about a vague diagnosis. You've got rheumatism. That's not very helpful, is it?
Not at all. So how did they even begin to untangle fibromyalgia from everything else?
That's a great question. It makes you wonder how they even knew where to start. Right. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up a bit. What is fibromyalgia? And maybe even more importantly, what isn't it?
Okay, so fibromyalgia 101. It is a chronic condition, that's for sure. But here's the thing. It's not an autoimmune disease, and it's not inflammatory in the way that, say, rheumatoid arthritis is.
So no runaway immune system, no out-of-control inflammation. That's important to know.
It is, because it helps us understand how to approach managing it.
Okay, so no rogue immune cells, no raging inflammation, but there's widespread pain. So what's going on there? What are people actually feeling when we talk about fibromyalgia pain?
Imagine having the flu, you know, that achy, everything hurts feeling.
Oh, yeah, I hate that.
Now imagine that lingering, not just for a few days, but weeks, months, even years. And on top of that, add muscle pain, bone-deep fatigue.
Ugh, the kind of fatigue where even if you sleep for a week, you still feel exhausted.
Exactly. And sometimes people with fibromyalgia describe it like their brain is in a fog, like it's hard to focus, hard to think straight.
Wow, that sounds beyond rough. How common is this, though? Are we talking about a small handful of people, or?
It's more common than you might think. Around 2% of the population, actually.
2%? So like 1 in 50 people.
That's about right, which is a lot more people than you'd expect, right?
Way more. No wonder we're diving into this. But how do you even know if you have it? Getting a diagnosis sounds like its own kind of ordeal, right?
Yeah, it can be a bit tricky. There's no single test for fibromyalgia. Instead, doctors often have to use something called a diagnosis by exclusion process.
Diagnosis by exclusion? What does that even mean?
So it means they have to rule out other conditions first, things that might have similar symptoms. And that's where a really thorough medical history, like what you discuss with your doctor, becomes super important.
So it's like playing medical detective, trying to find the clues that point to fibromyalgia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that makes it even more challenging is that not everyone who's experiencing these symptoms actually seeks help.
Seriously. But why wouldn't they?
There was a study done in London, Ontario, and it found that only a small percentage of people who were experiencing things like widespread pain and fatigue actually went to see a doctor about it.
Wow, that's so surprising. I mean, that's what doctors are, FOR, right? To help you figure out what's going on.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But sometimes it comes down to a lack of awareness. People might not even realize that what they're experiencing is fibromyalgia. They might think it's just stress or that it's normal to feel that way.
That's heartbreaking. Okay, so let's say you get a diagnosis. What happens next? Is there any hope for people with fibromyalgia?
Absolutely. And that is so important to remember. There's no magic bullet cure, but there are really effective ways to manage fibromyalgia and live a full life.
Okay, that's got to be reassuring for people to hear. But managing it, that sounds like it takes a multifaceted approach.
You're absolutely right. The Alberta Rheumatology resources really highlight 3 main pillars of management.
Okay, hit me with those pillars.
So we've got exercise, sleep hygiene, and education.
Let's break those down, starting with exercise. Because if you're in pain and exhausted, working out is probably the ass thing you want to do, right?
Right. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But that's where I think a lot of the misconceptions about exercise and fibromyalgia come in. We're not talking about intense gym sessions or anything like that. It's about starting slow and gradually increasing your activity level. The key takeaway here is that ADE movement is better than none. Even 5 minutes a day can make a difference.
Really? Just 5 minutes?
Yep, it all adds up.
So what, like a walk around the block? A quick swim?
Exactly. The resources actually mention those specifically. Walking, swimming, biking, Anything that gets your body moving at your own pace. It's all about listening to your body, not pushing it beyond its limits. And over time, that gradual increase can lead to some really significant improvements in pain levels and just overall function.
You know, it's amazing how powerful those small, consistent changes can be.
They really are.
Okay, so we've got exercise. What about sleep hygiene? That's something I think we could all use a refresher on.
Tell me about it. But for someone with fibromyalgia, it's not just about feeling well rested. It's about managing that fatigue, which can be, debilitating. And the great thing is, a lot of it comes down to simple habits.
Like what? Give me the good stuff.
One of the biggest ones is having a consistent sleep schedule. Like going to bed and waking up around the same time every day. Even on the weekends, which is tough, I know.
It's so hard, but so important.
It is. Another big one, creating a relaxing bedtime routine. Taking a warm bath, reading a book, things that signal to your body that it's time to wind down. Oh, and this one's a no-brainer, but avoid screens for at least an hour before bed.
Ugh, I know. The doom scrolling is so tempting, though.
I hear you, but it really does mess with your sleep.
Okay, what about the education piece? Where does that fit into managing fibromyalgia?
For me, it's all about empowering yourself. When you understand what's happening in your body and you have realistic expectations and you know how to cope with both the physical and the mental challenges of fibromyalgia, it can be incredibly empowering.
Knowledge is power, right?
Exactly.
And I guess that's where those Alberta rheumatology resources come in, right?
They're a gold mine. They've got evidence-based information, practical advice. They even have videos on their YouTube channel with experts in the field.
Awesome. Okay, so we've talked lifestyle changes, which are obviously super important. But what about medication? The sources mentioned it, but it didn't seem like it was the be-all and end-all solution.
Yeah, it's not always just about taking a pill, is it?
Definitely not a quick fix. Medication can be a part of managing the symptoms, but it's not the whole picture. They talked about medications like Cymbalta and Lyrica, which are sometimes prescribed. But
And we're not endorsing any specific medications here. It's always best to talk to your own doctor to see what's right for you. Absolutely. Every case is unique. And what I found interesting was that the research on how effective these medications are long-term,
yeah,
well, it's still kind of up in the air.
makes sense. These things take time to study.
Right. And another thing, they seem to be moving away from those strong painkillers like narcotics. Those aren't usually recommended for fibromyalgia.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, those are more for short-term pain management, not something long-term like fibromyalgia.
Exactly. Speaking of long-term, remember how we talked about functional MRIs earlier?
Yeah, getting a glimpse inside the brain and all that.
Yeah.
Super cool stuff.
Well, it turns out those brain scans are giving us some amazing insights into how pain works, especially for people with fibromyalgia.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
So they're finding that certain areas of the brain, the parts that deal with pain, perception, emotions, even decision-making, they're showing different activity patterns in people with fibromyalgia.
So it's not just about feeling pain more intensely, it's how their brains are actually processing those pain signals.
It's a whole different ballgame. One way to think about it, about phantom limb syndrome.
Yeah, where someone loses a limb, but they still feel pain where it used to be.
Exactly. It's like the brain is wired to feel that pain,
Yeah.
even though there's no physical cause for it anymore.
Wow, that's why.
Right. And there's more and more research suggesting that chronic pain, like what you see in fibromyalgia, might actually rewire the nervous system in a similar way.
So it's like the brain gets stuck in a pain cycle, even if whatever caused the pain in the first place is long gone.
It's a fascinating area of research.
It really is. I'm understanding now why they say it's so important to manage fibromyalgia with this holistic approach. Not just treating the symptoms, but looking at the whole person, mind, and body.
You got it. And speaking of holistic approaches, the stuff you gave me mentioned other therapies that could help manage symptoms. Things like mindfulness, yoga, acupuncture.
Yeah, I was curious about those. Are those actually backed by any science, or is it more like, well, it couldn't hurt to try?
It's actually pretty cool. Those practices have been around for ages, but now we're starting to study them scientifically, and the results are really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. Hit me with the science. What's the deal with these ancient practices?
Well, take mindfulness, for example. Studies are showing that when people practice mindfulness meditation, it can actually change the way their brains respond to pain.
Really? Like how?
It's like turning down the volume on those pain signals, making them less intense, less overwhelming.
Wow. So instead of getting totally consumed by the pain, you're learning to observe it without letting it take over.
Exactly. And then there's yoga. That's interesting because it combines movement, breathing exercises, and meditation.
It's like a 3-in-1 deal.
Right. And research suggests that regular yoga can help with inflammation, sleep, stress, all things that are super relevant for someone with fibromyalgia.
It's like a triple whammy of goodness. What about acupuncture? I've always been curious about it, but have to admit, a little intimidated too.
I get it, needles aren't for everyone. But it's worth looking into. They stick these super thin needles into specific points on your body, and it's thought to stimulate the release of endorphins. Those are your natural painkillers.
So you're basically tapping into your body's own pain management system. Pretty amazing if it works. But with all these different approaches, it still makes you wonder what causes fibromyalgia in the first place.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The truth is, we don't have a single definitive answer yet. But there's a lot of research happening on that front.
Like what kinds of things are they looking into?
Well, there's genetics, of course. They're also looking at whether infections could trigger it, maybe even psychological factors like trauma or chronic stress. It's a complicated puzzle, and we're still putting the pieces together.
It really is. So we might not have all the answers right now, but at least there's a lot of promising research underway. That's got to be reassuring for people.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, the focus is on finding ways to manage those symptoms and improve people's quality of life. And, one of the most important things you can do if you're dealing with fibromyalgia is to advocate for yourself.
Advocate for yourself. What do you mean by that?
Be proactive. Don't be afraid to ask your doctor questions. Do your own research. If you need to, get a second opinion. Find a doctor who really listens to you and takes your concerns seriously. Someone who'll work with you, not just tell you what to do.
That's so important. Finding the right doctor can make all the difference, but it can be overwhelming. Figuring out the right treatment plan, navigating all the options.
No doubt about it. And it's important to acknowledge the toll it can take on you emotionally and mentally. Living with chronic pain and fatigue isn't easy. Don't be afraid to reach out for help when you need it.
It's so true. So many people try to muscle through it on their own, thinking they shouldn't burden anyone else with it.
But that's what support systems are for, right? Friends, family, support groups. Having people who get it can make a huge difference.
For sure, that shared experience, knowing you're not alone, that's huge. But there's still so much stigma around invisible illnesses, isn't there?
Unfortunately, yes. People don't always understand what they can't see, and that can lead to judgments, misunderstandings. It's tough.
Which is exactly why education is so important, not just for people with fibromyalgia, but for everyone around them, families, friends, employers. We could all use a little more understanding.
I couldn't agree more. The more we talk openly about these conditions, the more we can break down those barriers and create a more supportive world for everyone.
I love that. And that's what I love about these deep dives, too. We get to really dig deep into these topics, go beyond the surface level.
Right. It's not just about skimming the headlines. It's about really understanding the nuances of these issues.
Exactly. And with something like fibromyalgia, there are so many layers to uncover. Speaking of uncovering, you mentioned functional MRIs earlier. What other kinds of research are they doing on fibromyalgia?
Oh, they're exploring all sorts of avenues, genetics, like we talked about, but also potential environmental triggers. And get this, there's been a lot of interest lately in the gut microbiome.
Wait, the gut microbiome? Like the bacteria that live in our intestines?
Yep. Sounds crazy, but there's emerging research suggesting there might be a connection between what's going on in our gut and chronic pain conditions like fibromyalgia.
You learn something new every day. So while we might not have all the answers yet, it seems like the research is headed in some really exciting directions.
It definitely is. There's a lot to be hopeful about. And in the meantime, it's about empowering yourself, advocating for your needs, and focusing on the things you can control.
So things like building healthy habits, managing stress, finding those support systems you talked about.
Exactly. It's about being proactive and reminding yourself that you're not defined by this condition. You can still live a full and meaningful life, even with fibromyalgia.
That is such an important message, and I think it's easy to lose sight of that sometimes, especially with the medical jargon, the uncertainty.
It's true. When you're first diagnosed, it's easy to feel overwhelmed.
Totally. But there is hope. And the more we learn about fibromyalgia, the more we realize we do have power to manage it, to live well.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone. There's a whole community of people who get it, who have been there, and who are there to support you.
It's all about finding your people. And speaking of finding things, those resources you mentioned from Alberta Rheumatology, those sound like a fantastic place to start.
They really are. They've got evidence-based info, practical advice. They even have connections to support groups and other resources.
That's awesome. It's like having a roadmap to help navigate the world of fibromyalgia.
It's about giving people the tools they need to take charge of their health journey.
I love that. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the basics of what fibromyalgia is, to the latest research, to the importance of a holistic approach to managing it.
It's been quite the deep dive.
It's like we've been on this journey, this deep dive into the world of fibromyalgia, uncovering clues, trying to make sense of it all.
It is like a puzzle, isn't it?
Totally. And we've connected a lot of the dots, but like any good mystery, there are always more layers to uncover.
That's what makes this feel so fascinating. There's always something new to learn.
Right. Even with all the research in progress, there are still so many unanswered questions about fibromyalgia.
Absolutely. It's a bit of a moving target.
It really is. Like, we're just scratching the surface of what we know about this condition. But hey, maybe that's the exciting part.
It definitely keeps things interesting.
It does. And who knows what the future holds? There's research happening right now that could totally change how we understand and treat fibromyalgia down the road.
Oh, for sure. The possibilities are endless, really.
Think about those functional MRIs we talked about, getting that glimpse inside the brain.
It's amazing what we can do with technology these days.
I know, right? It makes you wonder, what will brain imaging be like in 10 years? What will we be able to see then?
I have no idea, but I can't wait to find out.
Me too. And those genetic studies, remember we were talking about those? Who knows, maybe we're on the verge of identifying specific genes that make people more susceptible to fibromyalgia.
Wouldn't that be incredible? To be able to pinpoint those genetic markers.
Right. It could revolutionize treatment. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, it'd be like personalized medicine for fibromyalgia.
Exactly. Tailored to your unique genetic makeup.
So cool. But even with all these potential breakthroughs on the horizon, one thing really struck me in those resources you shared.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Just how deeply personal this condition is. It's not just a diagnosis, it's people's lives.
So true. Every single person experiences fibromyalgia differently.
What works for one person might not do a thing for another. And that's why I'm so glad those resources emphasize the importance of finding what works for you.
Absolutely. Don't give up hope. Stay curious. Be your own advocate. There are things that can help.
Yes. You have to become an expert in your own body. Learn to listen to those signals and work with your healthcare providers to find the right path forward.
It's a partnership for sure.
And that path might look different for everyone, right? There's no one right answer.
Exactly. What matters is finding what works for you.
And being kind to yourself along the way, because let's face it, living with a chronic condition like fibromyalgia is hard work.
It's a marathon, not a sprint, that's for sure.
Yeah, it is. You've got to have compassion for yourself. There will be good days and not so good days.
That's just part of life, right?
It is. And that's where those support systems we talked about come in. Connecting with people who truly understand what you're going through, sharing experiences.
There's something so powerful about that shared experience.
Right. Knowing you're not alone in this can make a world of difference. It makes you realize you've got this.
Exactly. You're stronger than you think.
And speaking of strength and resilience, I have to say I'm feeling a lot of hope after this deep dive. Even though there's still so much we don't know about fibromyalgia.
There's a lot of reason to be optimistic.
There is. Research is moving forward, awareness is growing, and people living with fibromyalgia are finding their voices. They're sharing their stories.
And those stories matter. They help to break down the stigma.
They really do.
Yeah.
And, they remind us that behind every diagnosis, there's a person with hopes, dreams, and the potential to live a really fulfilling life.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This deep dive has been amazing. We've learned so much about the science, the latest research, the importance of taking that holistic approach. But if there's one thing we want you to take away from all of this, it's that knowledge is power.
Absolutely. The more you know, the more empowered you'll be.
So keep asking questions, keep seeking out information, and never be afraid to advocate for your own well-being.
You are your own best advocate after all.
Couldn't agree more. And remember, you are not alone in this. There's a whole community out there who gets it, who's been there, and who's ready to support you every step of the way.
We're all in this together.
That's right. Well, this has been an incredible journey of exploration and discovery. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of fibromyalgia.
It's been my pleasure.
We can't wait to see where your own exploration takes you. Until next time.
This has been another episode of Arthritis and You, a Joint Journey. Brought to you by the Rheum team from albertarheumatology.com, your trusted evidence-based suite of resources available 24/7. Straight from Alberta, but for folks around the world. Our hosts today, arthritis and Sarah Upis, technical producer, John Ifun, and our executive producer, Stephen Cates. While we work hard to maintain the accuracy of our information, we accept no legal responsibility for any errors or omissions. Remember, always check with your own physician first. Join us next time for another Deep Dive.